joining us. Let me begin with asking about why you wrote this book on religion and the sciences of origins. That's very specific about sciences of origins. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I probably had similar sorts of motivations that bring people today to this webinar, and I've been interested in them since I was a college student, which was longer ago than I care to remember. And the biggest interest for me was that I was taught in my church to reject evolution. I was taught that evolution was in conflict with Christian belief. Yeah, but I was learning about evolution in my classes, and then I went to my PhD program, and I went to Notre Dame. And Notre Dame is a Catholic university. There are many religious believers there, and Catholics seem more friendly to evolution than my Protestant friends did, and it created a conflict for me when I was in graduate school, and it's a conflict that I explored for years and years and years, thought about, explored, read about, and gradually came to think that that issues in science and religion need to be addressed by religious believers, and they're important for religious believers, and they're scary for religious believers sometimes, and they're scary because science and religion are often placed in opposition, and I began to think they don't need to be placed in opposition. They should not be placed in opposition. And the place where people feel the most pressure with their religious beliefs is on different origin stories. We hear that God is the origin of this or that, God is the creator of this or that, and then science tells us something different about origins. So I think that the reason I decided to focus on origin stories is because I think origins is where we feel the pressure the most, and not just evolution, not just origins of species or origins of humanity, but also I discuss origins of morality. I look at evolutionary origins and cognitive origins of belief in God. I look at the origin of science and show that Christianity played a huge role in the development of modern science, a huge and crucial role in the development of modern science. So I look at quite a wide variety of origins. I look at the origin of the cosmos, and look at the fine-tuning argument that's based on that people have based on the origin of the cosmos. So I think I consider most of the key origin stories that are told, and then that are told by religious believers, and then look at how they might either be in conflict or go with what science says. And sometimes I argue that science overreaches in what they claim. And so sometimes I say the fault is on someone's understanding of religion. Sometimes the fault is on someone's understanding of science.
Right. So we live in the 21st century already, and some people think that the world is coming to an end already. Why do you think thinking about origins is still important now? What would it do for us to think about the future?
Well, I think one good thing is related to certain things that are going on in the future, and that is, I think a lot of Christians, at least a lot of American Christians, have become anti-science, and they've become anti-science, and they think it's brave and courageous to be anti-science, and their anti-science is motivated by their religious beliefs. And the anti-science starts with people who believe that the earth was created 4,000 or 6,000 or 10,000 or 100,000, some short period of time years ago, that it was created in 6 literal 24-hour days, that God created every part of the universe directly just by speaking it. And so that's the view that the really literal interpretation of what I think is really clearly poetry and metaphor. People that take really literal interpretations of those texts and think they've got to hold on to that no matter what. And so what happens is they become anti-science. And so the same people that are anti-science Christian believers in the United States are the same people that think the vaccine is that think the COVID virus is it's just like the flu. It's not serious. Not many people die from it. That don't trust vaccines. And to me, the biggest crisis that human beings face, probably the potential for the greatest human-made tragedy in history, will be global climate warming. And I think already hundreds of thousands have died and are suffering as a result. And religion, American Christianity, American Christian religion's inability to accept the science of global climate warming is just disastrous for human beings. So I think Christians need to be on the side and should be on the side of God created science, God created natural laws, our God created intellects. Instead, we're resisting, and by resisting, we're hurting people.
Yeah. So we are talking about science and religion, and these are two very difficult concepts. Can you explain a little bit what you mean by science and religion in your book?
Yeah, as Emil knows, I don't really define either science or religion. And the problem with any definitions, like you and I might come up with a definition of religion, and Christianity will probably be central in whatever definition of religion we have. We might come up with a definition of religion as relating to a God or one God, or a God who reveals things to us, or ritual practices like prayer and fasting and going to church services that we think help us relate better to God. So when we come up with definitions of religion, it tends to favor our own religion, and it tends to leave out other religions. The Buddha, for example, didn't believe in God. So how do you account for that in your definition of religion? So what I look at are several definitions of religion, and point out that there's not one really good definition that captures everything that we want to include, but doesn't leave anything out. Doesn't leave out, say, Buddhism, and there might be others that aren't coming to my mind right away. And the problem with defining science is that almost any definition you come up with science, and many scientists think they have a definition, and the standard definition is that you have some theoretical scientist comes up with a theory. The scientist tells you what the empirical implications of the theory are. The scientist hands the theory over to an experimentalist. The experimentalist checks the predictions that the theory makes in the laboratory or somewhere else. And then in so doing, if the experiment works, if the predictions are true, the theory is confirmed. If the predictions don't come about, then the theory is falsified. We just get rid of the theory. That's a really popular model of what science is. and it's not right. And it's not right for a lot of reasons. I'll just give one. It's not right because it doesn't really account for the historical sciences. So, geology, for example, is about how history developed in the past and in the long past, and it doesn't really make predictions about the future. It explains what we find, like in the fossil record, or the way rocks form in sediments, or how rocks formed, but it's a science that explains the past, and it doesn't really make predictions. So, so I think there's no good single definition of science. Probably you might come up with how things work in particular sciences, and there's no good definition of religion. But even without a definition, we know that Christianity is a religion, Islam is a religion, Judaism is a religion. Whatever a religion exactly is, we know those things are religions. And we know what people claim contemporary science teaches. So I just look at contemporary expressions of religion, or historical expressions of religion. I look at mainly at Christianity in my book, and claims that Christians make. And then I look at contemporary science and claims that science makes. And I take it from there.
Yeah, what's unique about your book? Because this is on science and religion. There were books already written on science and religion and the relationship between the two. What do you think is your unique contribution in this book?
I think there are several really unique contributions. I think many people have discussed, and probably better, the origin of modern science and and Christianity's central role in the origin and the development of modern science. And I think people have, and by the way, you could go back further. I don't know if there are any Muslims in the audience, but in the golden age of Islam, mathematics was developed, and something like a scientific method and an experimental method was developed, and both of those were, all three of those were essential to the development of modern science. So I talk about that in the book. And then many people have discussed the relationship of Christianity to evolution. So those are pretty standard in a lot of science and religion textbooks. I don't think very many at the time had done anything on cognitive science of religion and the evolutionary psychology of religion. I think mine is maybe the first book with a chapter on that topic. There are books on that topic, but I don't think most science and religion books have covered it yet. I also look at the evolution of morality. I think that's left out of most textbooks or introductions to science and religion. And I think most people ignore Islam and Judaism. So I have chapters on Islam and evolution, and Judaism and evolution. So I think there are some really unique features to the book that go well beyond what are in typical science and religion textbooks.
Yeah, these are really important topics. We'll come back to those later. Let me just ask you now about the historical discussions on science and religion in your book. What do you think we can learn from the historical discussions on science and religion for today?
Yeah. I think let me just make 2 points that I think are important. One is that when some scientist or some science writer tells you or tells us that science now has refuted this aspect of religious belief, or this aspect of Christianity, or this aspect of something, has disproven miracles, and the list could go on and on. But we feel this pressure, I think, even in this day and age. We read that science shows. Stephen Hawking, I think, said about 10 years ago that science has shown that there's no need for a creator.
Right.
And all right, science says this. Scientists say these things. And one thing that we can learn from the history of the interrelationship between science and religion is, don't get too excited when some scientist says that, and don't let it bother you too much. Dig into it a bit. I remember, I write about this in the book. A famous physicist said that the universe came from nothing, and I can't remember the name of his book. It's like The Universe from Nothing or something like that. Lawrence Krauss is his name. Book got a lot of attention. Richard Dawkins quoted it. Well, it turns out he didn't really mean that the universe came from nothing. And when you read it, you find out that it came from something. And then you have to ask, well, where did that something come from? But the book made a lot of headlines, and a lot of people got excited about it because a lot of people want religion not to be true. And when I see things like that, I just say, well, okay, I'll take a look. I'll see what the evidence is, and then I'll decide. And almost always in these sort of major claims that science refutes religious belief in this way or that way, they turn out not to be true. And so people have made these for a long time. You can just get used to thinking, okay, I'll take my time and try to figure out whether, what's going on here, what's really true and what isn't true. And I said there were two reasons why we should. Oh, the other reason, I think that we've slowly learned, and it's been hard for Christians to learn this. We've slowly learned that the Bible is not a scientific textbook. And I think a lot of people take it to be a scientific textbook. And so they think, I now look at it this way. God initially revealed truth to Iron Age peasants. And what he had to do was try to find a way to sort of come down to scientific peasants and bring ideas down and bring theology down and to speak in ways that they could understand, in stories and metaphors and images that they could grasp. And he wasn't that concerned that they get, E equals MC squared right, but he was concerned, or Big Bang Theory or something like that. But he was concerned that they get this: God created the heavens and the earth, and all that they contain, and that's what he wanted them to learn. We don't know how he did it. We don't know the science of it based on the scriptures. The Bible is not a scientific textbook, and I think the history of the relationship of science to religion increasingly shows us that.
Yeah, so you talked a couple of times already about metaphors and about interpretation. Is it fair to say that actually the conflict between science and religion is a conflict between interpretations? So an interpretations of science versus an interpretation of religion. Is this a war between interpretations?
Yeah, it's totally, well, the Bible doesn't interpret itself. We might say that, but it doesn't. The Bible doesn't wear its meaning on its sleeves sometimes. We have to think about it and figure it out. And there's some things that Christians have really stuck to, metaphors that they've really hung on to for a long time. For example, that the earth was created in 6 24-hour days, because that's what it says. But we haven't clung to the parts of the where it says, God hears, like we don't. None of us think God has ears. He doesn't hear with ears. It says he hears. Well, how do things hear? They hear with ears. God speaks. We don't think God has a mouth. We don't draw those interpretations from the metaphors. So there are some times when it's much easier for us to and sort of natural for us to not think they're metaphors, but we have to think that. We have to figure it out. So it's whatever you believe about God as revealed in the Christian scriptures, whatever you believe is interpretation. And it's that interpretation that sometimes is in conflict, not with science, but often with an interpretation of science. People often draw implications about what science shows. Science pretty clearly shows some things. For example, I think science has pretty clearly shown that the Earth is not at the center of our solar system. That really bothered some people a long time ago. Well, that was an interpretation. They thought that the Bible clearly taught that the Earth was at the center because it says, well, it feels like that. That's one thing, but there are sort of appearance claims in the Bible that the sun rises, for example, and the sun sets. Those it looks like the sun is moving, not the Earth rotating. So those are interpretations based on the Bible. I think the science is pretty clear that the Earth is not at the center and that the sun is at the center. The science is clear now that the Earth rotates on its axis, and that's why it appears that the sun rises and it appears that the sun sets, but it doesn't literally rise and set, even though it says that in the Bible. But then many people went on from that to claim that, well, humans aren't really special. The Earth isn't at the center of the cosmos anymore. Well, that's an interpretation of science. And humans could still be special and still be off on some planet, tiny little planet in some distant corner of the universe. We're special because we're created in God's image. That's what makes us special, not where we were created and what our location is in the cosmos. So oftentimes it's a clash between, it's always a clash between interpretations. And sometimes the fault is on the interpretation of Scripture. Sometimes the fault is on the interpretation of science.
Yeah. So, for example, the statement that God is light, for example, that seems to be a metaphor because light has properties of a particle as well. So God cannot have those properties.
No.
But people are worried when we talk about metaphors and what to do about, for example, Adam and Eve. Are they metaphorical as well? Are they real people or not? Right? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I deliberately don't discuss Adam and Eve in my book. So you're just asking me what I think, and Adam and Eve are more difficult, not because I think it's not. If you only had the Old Testament, I would think Adam and Eve are metaphorical. If all you had was the Old Testament, because it occurs in the first 10 chapters of Genesis that are, to me, telling narratives, stories about various origins, like where the Tower of Babel, where do languages come from? Why doesn't everyone speak the same language? Well, God scattered people and they spoke different languages. I actually don't think that's the point of the Tower of Babel story, and we miss the point if we think it's about the origin of languages. But a lot of people take it that way. What's the origin of the historical conflict between shepherds and farmers? There's sheep herds, literally sheep herds. They eat the grass and they move around, and sometimes they're more nomadic. Farmers are more agricultural and fixed, and so there's a historical animosity, and so you have Cain and Abel fighting one another, and one's a farmer and one's a shepherd. And at any rate, I think there's a lot of origins stories in the beginning. And if all you had was the Old Testament, I would say you should think it's a myth trying to explain Well, the origin of sin. That's the story it's trying to explain. Paul seems to take it literally. And so that creates a tension for Christians, that St. Paul seems to think that just as Jesus was historical, Adam was historical, that just as Jesus died to forgive to atone for our sins, so Paul died, Adam and Eve introduced sin into the world. So Paul seems to take it literally. The science on this is really difficult, but it doesn't look like the genetic picture doesn't look like human beings could have possibly come from two individual human beings, that our genes don't trace back to two people, our genes trace back to 10 or 20,000 people. So I think Christians need to come up with a new understanding of Adam and Eve. And this is a tough case. I'm just going to say it's a tough case. I don't have a resolution for it. I didn't discuss it because it's such a hot topic now, and I don't have much to say about it. I understand why it's a difficult issue for Christians. I understand the science doesn't work the way that you might think it would work. Like, it does seem like you should be able to trace all human beings back to a primordial couple, but biology says we can't. I think the biology on this is pretty good, but I leave that for other people like Emil to think about.
Right. Yeah, it's a very hard topic. And the Catholic Church, like you said, is actually more receptive to evolution and the Big Bang theory. In 2014, Pope Francis actually said that the Big Bang theory and evolution do not conflict with the notion of creation. And coming from the Pope himself, this is very striking, but it took centuries for Catholics to arrive at this point.
Yeah.
There were lots of resistance against science in the Catholic Church, but we also see that there are a lot of Catholic priests contributing significantly to the sciences. What can other
Big Bang, by the way, the theory of the Big Bang was developed by a Belgian priest,
right?
and Einstein didn't like it because it showed that the universe had a beginning, and he thought that was just too close to there being a creator, and he didn't want there to be a creator. And people say Einstein was religious, but he wasn't a theist. He did not believe in God. He may have been religious, but nothing he said was really very friendly to there being a God. And it wasn't until he heard that priest speak a second time and then saw the mathematics and saw that the mathematics came from equations that Einstein discovered, that he said, this is a really beautiful theory that you've come up with. And then began to think that it was true, that it was a consequence of Einstein's own equations.
Yeah, so there are religious groups like that. The Catholics are like that. They make progress in their understanding of sciences. The Anglicans are like that as well. What can other religious groups
Are way more like that. Historically, Muslims were, but they stopped about the 12th century AD. Protestants need a pope for some things. We have gurus. Protestants have gurus, people that they think are trustworthy and authoritative, and we tend to gather around those gurus. And I think that's not a good thing. At any rate, the Pope did better on this than Protestants have done.
Yeah, what can other religious groups learn from from the Catholics and the Anglicans and Muslims in the past about embracing more science.
So the Pope's essays on these topics are usually really good, even if you disagree. Like if you end up disagreeing with the perpetual virginity of Mary. Suppose you don't agree with the perpetual virginity of Mary. You might still read what reasoning was offered, because often it's really brilliant. There are lots of things I agree with the Pope on, and I think they're even better. The reasoning's even better. And the Catholic Church's slow embrace of science, but they have come to accept it. I think it took them 350 years or so to forgive Galileo,
Right.
who was a faithful son of the church, by the way. It took a long time to admit they made a mistake, but they did admit it, which is good, better than not admitting it. And they've become, I think what Christians should be is really pro-science, that we should think God created us with intellects to grasp. And then here's what I think we should grasp: the two books that God's written. And one is the book of Revelation, and the other is the book of nature. And we act like our minds are only made to work with the book of Revelation, and then we have to deny really good information that we can get from the book of nature. And God created that too. And not only did he create that, he created us with the cognitive abilities that if we work really hard, we can understand the book of nature too. And we shouldn't deny that. To me, it's a sort of disobedience, not to turn off our minds when it comes to thinking about the creation.
Yeah. So you depend on this doctrine of the two books by Augustine, and there are other religious groups that might not embrace this Augustinian thinking. Are there other ways for them to reconcile science and religion, if not through the Augustinian doctrine of the two books? Is saying that God or the Holy Scripture is not a scientific hypothesis? Is that enough to reconcile science and religion without embracing Augustine's doctrine of the two books?
Well, I think you don't have to know that it's from Augustine, but I think you do have to know that the heaven is the handiwork of God, and that we're supposed to, and that God has made things apparent to us through what has been made, it says. So to me, it goes back to St. Paul, and it goes back to just thinking, to me, a little bit. This fits in, as you know, with my views about how we know things, and that is that we were created by God to grasp truths. And I think we could be skeptics, or maybe even should be skeptics otherwise. So to me, it's a Pauline insight. You might look at it this way. If I want to know what the weather is, I look at meteorologists. I don't just try to pray and say, and I don't believe that God instantly makes it rain, or that God instantly makes it snow, which is closer to the truth here. I think that God works through processes to create rain. And we know those much better. They're not completely accurate, but I turn on the news and I listen to the weather report from people who are using the sciences to do it. I think that's the way God has created us to know weather patterns. I think 2,000 years ago, human beings thought God did it directly. But I don't think most of us think that anymore. We're just sort of used to thinking that God uses processes to bring about various things. So I don't know. It's just, to me, it's a kind of common sense that that we have different ways of thinking about things than just thinking God did it. That's not saying God did it. Isn't really much of an answer to any question. And the answer sometimes that we're looking for is how does God do it? And I think most of the time we think God does things through natural processes, and we don't get worried. So I'll just to get this point home, we don't get worried. 2,000 years ago, people would have thought God directly caused the thunder, and now we understand, how electrons are, bumping up against each other and creating charges, and they want to release, and so we think that now. Well, that's how it works. And I'd say, well, this is how our knowledge of the natural world works. Well, in various ways, but science is a more appropriate way of knowing that than just reading the Bible.
Right. So Indonesia has more religions than just the Abrahamic religions.
Yeah.
So we have Buddhism and Hinduism and Confucianism. What do you have to say about the tension between science and religion in non-Abrahamic religions? Have you thought about that?
I haven't thought a lot about it. I do think this, and this will be all that I'll say, is that religions of the book, religions that have really particular revelations, and by religions of the book, I really mean Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There are books that are revealed to people, religions of the book, and there could be others. There are a lot of other religions are more like, I'm not entirely sure there's really an authoritative book for Buddhists, for example. Well, if you don't have a book that makes claims, then you're going to have a lot fewer conflicts with science. So I think the issues in science or religion are especially pressing for religions that claim to have a revelation that's written down in a book, and the book is authoritative. Those religions are going to have way more problems. And honestly, I just don't know enough about Buddhism and Hinduism and more folk religions in Indonesia to make any claims. But I will tell you this: if they have a very detailed sacred text, a book, then they're way more likely to have conflicts with science.
Right. In your book, you are arguing that religion is not only compatible with science, but actually religion is indispensable for the advancement of the sciences. Can you give some examples? You tell us a little bit about that. How does religion help science advance?
I think a lot of the there's no exact scientific method, but there are a lot of assumptions that science makes and that it must make. And those assumptions, I think, fit better in with a religious worldview, and not just a religious worldview. I think something like a Judeo-Christian worldview. Scientists assume that the uniformity of nature, that the laws are true. The laws that we find here on Earth are the same as they are on the Moon and on Mars and on the Sun, and you can go infinitely in either direction, and there'll be the same laws there. And so what we have learned here is something that's true everywhere. Well, the universe exceeds even our ability to sort of see it. even through telescopes, we're limited by the speed of light. And so there's the limit of the known. There's the known universe, which is much information as we can get given the speed of light, how long it takes to get to us. And then there's the unknown universe beyond that. So there's a lot we don't have access to. We have no idea how much we don't have access to of the universe. And there may be multiple universes. We don't know that yet either. But we think in our universe, the laws are uniform, that what's true here is true everywhere. And that gives us reason to extrapolate from the Earth to the cosmos, to the solar system, to our galaxy, beyond our galaxy, to other solar systems. I think that fits best with thinking that God created, like one God created the universe in a rational, single way. I'll give one more example, and then I'll give two more quick examples. One is that there's no good solution to the problem of induction. And the problem of induction is that we don't really have good reason to think the future will be like the past. So how can we make predictions into the future? It's a difficult philosophical problem, but I think if we have God-created cognitive faculties that are truth-aimed, then we have reason to trust that the predictions that we make into the future will be like the past. And in general, I think that we think that we have the ability to know things about the natural world. And again, I think there are reasons, if you're not a theist, to be skeptical, to be a skeptic about our knowledge of the natural world or about our knowledge of anything. But if our cognitive faculties are created by God, the cognitive faculties we use to understand the world, and that we use to understand God, that the idea that our cognitive faculties are reliable makes more sense within a God-created world than it does a world that, of naturalism or materialism, that everything just came about by chance for no reason, no purpose. I think that gives us no reason to trust our cognitive faculties. But if we were created by God and God wanted us to grasp the truth about Him and the world, that gives us reason to trust our cognitive faculties. So I think science, modern science arose in a religious theological worldview, and it flourishes in that, although most scientists don't recognize that. They'll think that they don't dig down deep enough into the roots to see what they're assuming. But what science must assume is something that fits much better within a worldview of Christian theism, that we were in, or Judeo-Christian theism, or Judeo-Christian Islamic theism, that we were created by God in part to know the truth.
Yeah, so there's this idea about infinite space, and science starts thinking about what is infinite. That is difficult. And when Stephen Hawking talks about the beginning of time, and there's a question about how does it all start? I mean, there was the Big Bang, but why the Big Bang happened in the first place? That's very difficult.
Yeah, many atheists, by the way, atheist scientists have become theists because of the Big Bang. Like they thought, oh, we thought before the universe just was eternal and existed forever and is unchanging, and we know that it's not. We know that it had a beginning at time. There was a time where t equals 0. Well, what brought it all about? It looks a lot more like creation ex nihilo than it does, well, anything else. Like we have nothing else to imagine.
Right. Yeah. Now, when we talk about science and religion, we seem to talk about philosophy as well. So there are some philosophical discussions in the issue of science and religion. How important do you think for us to understand philosophy and in order to understand this issue of science and religion?
So in one way, I mean, I like the way you qualified at the end. If you want to understand science and religion, in one way, I think, well, I don't mean to turn anyone into a philosopher. I don't think my grandmother, who was a great religious believer, but spent all of her time raising her children. Her husband died of cancer when he was 44. She had 5 children, and she raised them during the Depression. She had enough to worry about, than to try to solve the problem of evil or the relationship of science to religion. She went to church. She read her Bible. She was a good woman. Not everyone needs to be a philosopher. If you do want to understand science and religion, if these issues bother you and you want to come to some understanding of it, then you have to understand some philosophy. There are philosophical issues involved. I've raised several already without saying them by name sometimes. I think they're ones that you can grasp. I try to write clearly in the book. I try to assume that nobody, I try not to assume that anybody knows anything special, either about science or about theology or about philosophy. So I have, for example, I put some of the biblical texts in that people make claims about and let people look at them and see the text and then decide. I put a lot of the science in to get people to see what the science is, and I try to do it all really clearly, and then I raise philosophical issues. For example, I have a discussion of free will. Well, what is free will? And now all of a sudden you're a philosopher when you try to say what it is, and there are different reasons for thinking what it might be. There's no one definition that everybody accepts. So you can't. So I talk about the origin of free will or something like that. But you cannot discuss that without making philosophical distinctions. And I don't mean that like really abstract, impossible to understand. If you're scared of philosophy, don't worry about this book. I think Emma would probably be a better judge because he translated it. I try to write really clearly and not assume that you know all of the ideas, and I try not to make it too abstract for people. And yet, you cannot think about these issues without bringing philosophy in.
Right. Thanks. So we are in the Q&A time now, and there are a couple of questions about evolution. Let me just read this. This one is from Tom Jones, asking about how should we, again, reconcile the claim of evolution and the claims of Christianity. And there's another question from Chandra Leonardo. So again, asking about the reliability of the evolution theory. So maybe this is one of the concerns that people have. People say, why believe in evolution? It's just a theory. There is no evidence for it. It's in the past. How do you address that kind of concern in the book?
So I have one chapter, and I aim this at Christians who think that evolution is just a theory. Well, it is a theory. That's true. It's a theory that that the sun is at the center of our solar system. That's a theory too. There are lots of things in science that are theories. Almost all of them are theories. It doesn't mean that there's not really good evidence for it. So there's some theories that I suppose are just a theory. Um, you might have heard about string theory in physics. It's just a theory. There's no evidence for it. I don't know what it is exactly either. I just know that there's no evidence for it. Some people say that there are multiple universes. Ours isn't the only universe. There are but there are probably countless other universes in addition to ours. That's just a theory. There's no evidence for it. But evolution is a well-established scientific theory with lots of evidence in support of it. And so I have a chapter both on what the evidence is, and then how and why we should think that when you have a theory that can explain all of these different bodies of evidence under one unifying conception, that gives you good reason to think that it's true. And to me, let me just give one example. Evolution says that believes in what's called common descent, the theory of common descent, that that there was a primordial being, some amoeba or something, some single-celled something or other, and it had and Darwin didn't know this, but it had genetic information in it, and that every other species came from that being. Well, it turns out that there are, and you can follow this through. It turns out that there are traces. We bear within our DNA genetic evidence of that primordial being and of prior species. So, just for example, we all have what's called junk DNA. So this is DNA. You have a long string of proteins, and some of the proteins are turned off. They don't do anything anymore. If they were turned on, or if they get turned on, a human being might be born with a tail, for example. And some human beings are sometimes born with a tail, but in general, they're turned off. So there's gene sequences, and it turns out we have our gene sequences are identical to pre-existing species, and then the sort of higher up you go in the evolutionary tree, the sequences that we have, for example, we have gene sequences that are the same as the fly's gene sequence, with the same thing in the exact same order turned off. And then we have way more of those gene sequences with different genes that are turned off than, say, other primates. So, well, what's the best explanation that you've got that we share gene sequences for one thing, but that we have the same sort of switches turned on and off in them, that they're in the exact same order and in the exact same place in invertebrates, that gene is turned off in every species from then on. It's really quite remarkable, unless you think that we share common ancestors, and that we descended from pre-existing species.
Yeah, but people say, well, it's science, but science progresses. Sometimes it's refuted in the future. So, is it still possible that evolution is refuted in the future because it can be wrong, just like previous sciences?
I think so. We don't think this about like E equals MC squared. Nobody wrote a question about E equals MC squared. I promise you, there was not a single question about E equals MC squared. There was not a single question about any quantum phenomena. No one asked any questions about those in the questions. And and people are happy with those theories, except they could all turn out to be false. All scientific theories could turn out to be false. No matter how good your evidence is, someone might come up with a better theory that better explains the evidence. And we know that this is going to be true in physics, because in physics, I think it's the general theory of relativity, makes predictions that conflict with quantum mechanics. So it looks like quantum mechanics and the general theory of relativity cannot both be true. And so some scientists are trying to figure out ways that science can be fixed so they both could be true, but it may just be the case that they can't both be true. No one's figured out a better way to think about it. Evolution is, it's true, totally true that it could turn out to be false. So every scientific theory could turn out to be false. But I look at it more like the evidence that the sun is at the center of our solar system and that we revolve around the sun. Well, that could turn out to be false. And by the way, you can develop mathematics. You can come up with a mathematical model, and you'd have to come up with different theories of motion. And the theory of gravity would have to be, you'd have to have a new theory of gravity. There's a lot of things you'd have to change. But I think the evidence is really compelling that the sun is at the center of our solar system, and that the Earth revolves around the sun, and that it rotates on its axis every 24 hours. The evidence is super compelling.
Yeah, so it's reasonable to believe that, although, of course, science can turn out to be false. Yeah.
I think evolution is more like that,
Yeah.
with massive amounts of evidence in support of it. And it could be false, than it is like the conflict between quantum mechanics and the general theory of relativity, where we know one of them can't be true. And honestly, the evidence, I'll just leave it at that. I think
Yeah.
that it's a theory, but the evidence is massive for common descent.
Yeah. Here's a question from Daniel Winardi. Some people say that the real conflict is not between religion and science, but naturalism and science. Maybe supernaturalism? I'm not sure, but how do you respond? Is the conflict between naturalism or maybe supernaturalism?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think that the mistaken picture that God is the immediate cause of everything has created it creates a sort of felt case for naturalism. And so I'll look at it like this. So everyone used to think that, for example, before the principle of inertia, it was thought that somehow God ultimately moves all the planets. That these big planet things, no one had a theory for how they, people thought, so here's a book on my hand. How does it move? It moves by me pushing it, and if I stop pushing it, it stops moving. And people thought planets moved like that. So God somehow has to push all the planets. So there was an argument that goes back to Aristotle and probably earlier, that ultimately God pushes all the planets. God's the first mover. He sort of pushes things, and then at any rate, the planets get moving. Well, when the principle of inertia was discovered and the law of gravity, God didn't need to push the planets. So if things are moving, they keep moving without being pushed. At least in space or in a vacuum where there's no air to resist. So the principle of inertia made it look like, well, all right, we don't need God to move the planets. And Newton thought, well, we don't need God to move them, but the natural laws at his time weren't 100% right. So Newton thought like every 50 years God has to come in and give the planets a boost, or they would just sort of run out of steam. So Newton thought there was still this role for God. God just he doesn't have to push the planets all the time, but he's got to give them a boost every 50 years. Well, as science developed, the laws became more accurate, and people figured out, nope, you don't need God to enter in and give them a boost. And so Laplace is alleged to have said, when he was the greatest mathematical astronomer of his day, and he's alleged to have said to Napoleon, I think in 1801, where Napoleon asked about the sort of Newtonian system, well, where does God fit in? And Laplace is alleged to have said, I have no need of that hypothesis. And so it looks like all these things that people have thought God did it, God did it, God moves the planets, God adjusts the planets, God causes thunder and lightning, and then you think, well, God doesn't do that, or He doesn't do it that way. It's natural laws that do it. Slowly, what's happened is that the supernaturalist view that God does everything is no longer tenable. Well, naturalism starts to look more likely that nature sort of works on its own, and that you don't need to appeal to God for anything. And so I think supernaturalism and naturalism are what's really being where the real issues are. And historically, because of the way that human beings thought, God did everything, and did it directly, and then began to learn that things operate by natural law. It begins to start to look like at least that understanding of supernaturalism can't be right. Well, and then people think, well, supernaturalism can't be right. It looks like we've made a lot of progress towards naturalism. And a lot of intellectuals today are naturalists. They think that everything can be explained through natural processes. And so to me, I think that's where Christians should focus a lot of effort, is defending supernaturalism against naturalism. That's where a lot of effort should be focused.
Right. Here's a question from Samuel Jonathan. He says, religion relies on subjective spiritual experiences as a way of knowing religious knowledge, so religious experience in epistemology, whereas science relies on objective empirical observations in knowing the world. So is there an epistemic conflict between the two here? One is on religious experience, the other is on empirical observations.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. It's hard. So this is why I think people need better understandings about what can be proved and what can't be proved, and both our reliance sometimes on religious experience. I think people overstate their religious experiences. So I think if some coincidence happens, you'll hear Christians say, "Oh, that was a God thing." Like they have some direct knowledge, and I think that's direct knowledge of the way God works, and I don't think any of us has that actually. But some sense of the divine, I think, I think it's close to the truth that God has built that into us. I think in pretty reliable ways. And we have cognitive faculties that move us in that direction, just like we have cognitive faculties that move us in the direction of observations that are built up, and then explanations offered for in the sciences. So I think it's hard to make a really strict division between the cognitive faculties that are used to and try to understand religious experience and the cognitive faculties that are used to understand the sciences. In the sciences, we have more intersubjective checks, I guess is the way I would look at it. It's not the problem that religion is sort of all subjectivity, but there's a lot, and probably more in this than in the sciences, because the sciences does have there's a lot of things people agree to in the sciences, and the agreements aren't things that are proven, and they're not usually even spoken of. But given all these agreements, then you can end up agreeing on other high level things. All those things, we tend to forget those things we agree on are ones that are a lot more like religious beliefs than they are like collections of observations. And so I
Yeah.
guess that's how I'd put it.
Yeah, it's so Alston has that in Perceiving God, that scientists have a double standard, because sense perception itself cannot be proved to be reliable by science.
Yeah, that's the part down below where you
Yeah,
assume it. You
right.
assume
Yeah,
sense perception.
just an assumption that sense perception is irreliable. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Here's a question by Jessica. It is interesting that you discussed about the evolution of morality in your book. Why does morality evolve? Does it mean that morality is somehow dynamic?
So I'm not looking at how morality changes. In some sense, I'm assuming that morality is roughly the same, and I'm asking this: could it have come about by evolution, by natural selection? That's the question I'm asking. There are sort of sociological questions. For human beings, once you have civilizations, does morality evolve or change? And for the purposes of that chapter, I define morality, and I do it because you have if people make a claim that morality evolved, what they're saying in the case that I look at is that we don't need a God to ground moral truths. We got moral truths from evolution by natural selection, and so I'm looking at people that think that there's like a scientific case for morality, like there's a natural alternative to God to ground morality, and I argue that evolution cannot ground morality. That evolution can talk about how there's a lot of things that it can illuminate that are like our capacity to be moral, for example. It can illuminate why we might be more inclined to help our kin than to help our neighbor, or even more difficult, our way distant neighbor. There's a lot of things that it can explain, but it cannot explain either the truth of morality or the authority of morality, what I call moral oomph, that morality places a demand on us. Evolution can't place demands on us. It can make us feel a demand. It could, in principle, make us feel a demand, but it doesn't. Feeling a demand doesn't mean that we have a demand. I might feel. It explains really powerfully why human beings might feel like they ought to have sex with somebody. So you can feel that, but it doesn't mean that you ought to do that. So feeling really powerfully that you ought to do something doesn't mean that you should. And evolution doesn't really, natural selection can't really distinguish between the feelings powerful to do things from the ones that are good and the ones that are bad. That takes something different. So I actually argue that you cannot, I'm not talking about how morality may have changed over time in different human communities. I'm not talking about that kind of evolution. I'm just talking about evolution by natural selection and asking, can it provide a non-theistic ground for morality? And I argue that it cannot.
Here's a question about.
Oh, by the way, I don't argue that exactly. I argue that it cannot provide a natural ground for morality. I have about 2 sentences in the end about whether so you might want to look for a non-natural solution or a supernatural solution. I don't really offer any supernatural grounding of morality.
Here's a question about miracles. So for evangelical Christians who have scientific mindset, how can they believe in miracles as stated in the Bible?
I think if you're a naturalist, you probably should not believe in miracles, but you probably should think that things sort of proceed on and on by natural law. I look at miracles like this. Here's what the natural law says. If I drop this book, it falls, and I can do it all sorts of times. If I drop it, it falls. So there's the way the universe usually works, like 99.999999999, and I could keep going percent of the time. God's created a reliable universe for us to live in, and it operates in really reliable ways. And then sometimes, but very rarely, God decides to intervene. So, like, it would hit, except God doesn't suspend the laws. He just intervenes and keeps the thing from falling. That's how I look at miracles. I think that we should think of natural laws as the way God normally works. Again, 99.9999999, and go on and on percent of the time. And then we should think of that sometimes God thinks for some reasons, and I actually think it's pretty rare. I think miracles happen by and large to authenticate divine messengers, like Jesus, for example, or Moses. And so there are miracles that happen very rarely for specific reasons. But we should think that God decides that this is so important that he's going to put his hand in and stop the book. He's going to stop the waves. The natural laws aren't suspended, but God is opposing them for a little bit and for a reason. But I think that's all I'll say there.
Yeah. Here's another question from Jedidah. There's this author, Yuval Noah Harari, in his book, Sapiens. He says that religion rejects the theory of evolution because it rejects the notion of soul, and that humans are special or unique in comparison to other animals. Yeah. Is that true, that the theory of evolution entails the rejection of the soul?
So I have a chapter on the origin of persons, and I look at the origin of souls, and I show how evolutionarily God could have, or souls could have arisen. Or I also think that we might not have souls, like we might just be. I don't know if I hold this view or not. I'm not sure what I think actually, but there are Christians who think we don't have minds. Who don't think that we have souls or spirits. We're just we're like creatures. We're physical. And the creed says, "I believe in the resurrection of the body, in the life everlasting." But a lot of Christians think that what the creed really means is, I believe in the resurrection of the soul, like we have souls that float out forever, independent of our bodies. But the only conciliar statement on this topic is that I believe in the resurrection of the body. And there are many contemporary Christians who think that that we have minds, that we're really different from the animals, but not so different. Both of us are completely embodied creatures. and that we're free. The list could go on, and that we rise again from the dead. But it's I rise from the dead, not my soul. At any rate, I offer a few models for how I think Harari's just wrong about how it's even possible for souls to for God to use the process of natural selection and for us also to have souls. They could have evolved in certain ways. God could just plant them in human beings at certain times. So I think there are options there. The Harari book is actually really terrific if you haven't read it, but he is very reductionistic about everything. It's a really interesting, challenging book.
Right. Yeah, we need to wrap up our interview here, but let me ask you about the interreligious dialogue now on science and religion, because you have a chapter on Islam and a chapter of Judaism. How do you think the issue of science and religion can bring different religions together?
Yeah, good question. Emil knows because he was part of a 3-year project that I did with almost 40 Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and the project was for us to partly not to hate each other. You know, there's so much division and animosity in the world, and I look at Jesus, who says we're supposed to love our neighbor, and he says enemy. Well, I don't think most Muslims and Jews are our enemy, but a lot of people do, especially Americans. A lot of Americans have a lot of hostility towards Muslims, and at any rate, we don't love people who are different from us most of the time. A seminary professor in Grand Rapids asked his students to keep a running list of all the people that they met throughout the day, and to do it for a week. Who did you meet for a week? Like at the grocery store, at the gas station, who did you actually interact with? And to do it for a week, and they found out that the Christians, it was a Christian seminary, they only interacted with other Christians. Their kids went to Christian schools, they went to Christian churches, they took their kids to youth groups, they went to midweek religious meetings, they hung out with Christian friends. They only ever talked to Christians, and the world is not a better place because we all hang out in our tribe with people who are just like us. So I think we need to be way more proactive as followers of Jesus in reaching out to people who are different from us. And not just for evangelism. I think we should do it just to love them, period. So Emma was part of a 3-year project on randomness and providence. And that project was partly on how, if randomness is built into into science, how God could still bring about what God wants, how God could be provident. And I thought Muslims, Christians, and Jews probably share a lot of ideas on these topics. And I also think this, that if people of difference come together for a common task, they're more likely to overlook their differences and to allow their commitment to the common task to unite them. You don't have to talk all the time with Muslims about Islam or Christianity. You could go and, I don't know, build a house together and just stand there and pound nails all day and talk about pounding nails and about your kids and can you get the next board, and it's time for lunch, and you eat lunch. And anyway, you find out people are human beings, that if you can work on a common task and not focus on your difference, that you can do a lot that unites people. So science and religion is a topic that can bring people together. And with Muslims, Christians, and Jews, we share a lot of God beliefs. We all have Holy Writ in the case of Judaism and Christianity, we share the majority part of our sacred texts. How can we bring those together? Anyway, Emma was part of this 3-year project. We have a book coming out on randomness and providence. There was a lot of suspicion at the very beginning. And I'll tell you one story and then we'll move on. We met in Kalamazoo, Michigan in our first meeting, and we did a lot of activities to sort of try to unify people. Muslims and Christians and Jews shared rooms together. We took all of our meals together. Sometimes we talked philosophy, but about day 3, one of the Jews walked up to a Muslim and said, "You want to kill me, don't you?" And anyone who heard was just like shocked. But I know a lot of people think it. Like they think that Muslims have this secret desire to kill, well, especially Jews. A lot of Jews feel, a lot of Americans think they want to kill Americans, but a lot of Jews who live in Israel think all Muslims want to kill them. And the Muslim guy who was asked is such a kind, patient guy, and he says, no, I don't. And then they went to dinner together and they talked long into the night. And by the end of the week, the Jew walked up to the Muslim again on the very last day and gave him a hug. And it was really gratifying to see the progress that had been made, because we have a lot of fears of people who are different from us, and we can use science and religion we don't even have to agree, on science and religion. Like, who cares about exactly how God does this or that? We're not that committed to our theologies or really abstract philosophies or this, but we were committed to thinking together and taking each other seriously. And often people agreed. Did you write a paper with a Muslim, Emma?
Yeah, I did. I
Yeah.
wrote a paper with Shoaib.
Yeah. So he wrote with a Muslim scientist, actually, on how God works in the world. I totally disagree with what they wrote about, and yet, I don't know how God does it, so write about it, think about it. It was a really cool paper. They worked together. That's a good thing. And I don't have to agree. We don't have to agree. But you can find people who agree and work together. You can find people who disagree but do it in charity and can work together and write good papers. So anyway, I think it is. I think it would be a model actually for Indonesia to do a Muslim Christian project. It would be a good thing for Muslims and Christians to come together to do something in science and religion. I think the Templeton Foundation might fund it, and I think it would bring people together that just don't come together very often. And we need to bring people together. Christians need to show more love.
Yeah. So where do we go from here? You have written this book on science and religion. What's next?
For me or we?
For you, in general, where do you think the research on science and religion should go from here?
So I think there's a lot of topics that we haven't thought much about. And so I think more people need, the guy who asked isn't the real question supernaturalism or naturalism? By the way, I have a chapter on that in the book, but I think that is the real question. People need to look at it. I think a lot of work in science and religion is, like on free will, is pretty new, and people are still thinking about it. I tried to put together, but I didn't get funded. I think that we don't understand the science of love. There's a lot of work on romantic love, what goes on in romantic love, and there's a lot of work about like kin love, a lot of scientific work on it. not much. It's just in its infancy, but not so much on neighbor love, and definitely not on stranger love. And I'm inclined to think actually that love of stranger is impossible. And I think love of stranger is impossible. And I think there's a Bible verse that wasn't thinking about science, but makes a good point. Perfect love casts out all fear. And so I view fear and love as enemies, not fear and hate. Hate is an expression of fear. And that if you have fear in your heart, that's our sort of initial instinctive reaction to people who are different from us is fear. And we might also hate them, but that's a product of fear. But that means it's impossible for us to be empathetic. We can't fear and be empathetic. And I think the highest form of Christian love is for us to have empathy, to feel with someone who's suffering, to understand their suffering and their pain, and then to work to relieve it. So I think empathy is part of the deepest form of human love. Well, then the question is, well, what are we supposed to do? How should we understand love of enemy? I'm writing a book right now, and I'm almost done actually, on love in the Abrahamic traditions. And I, I don't do that much with the science. There are a couple places where I bring it in, but I think it would be a really cool project for people for religious believers to try to come with a deeper understanding of what their traditions teach about love. And then, well, what does science have to say? How can science help us understand it? It's helped me understand the perfect love casts out all fear thing. And because I think the other side is true, that fear casts out all love, that fear makes it impossible to love. So then you have to relieve fears before you can get to a point of loving somebody. How does that happen? What does the Bible say about it? I don't know. It's helped me understand and make distinctions among the different forms of love in the Bible. And then the Bible doesn't say everything about this. I don't think we should think the Bible is the exhaustive place for information on love. Well, but if you want to understand it, where else can we get information? And science may help us here. I don't really know. All of this is at its infancy, so there are lots of topics that where science is making claims that are really relevant and interesting. There are lots more I can tell you. I think I'll just stop there.
Yeah, seems like there are a lot of progress in science now with the artificial intelligence, robotics. That's the question of the soul now. But this seems like a good place for us to stop. And I would like to thank you again for, first of all, for writing the book and letting us read the book in Indonesian, for letting us translate this book, and also for your time to be here to discuss this with us. I would like to encourage the participants. Thank you, by the way, for your time. So I've read the book at least 3-4 times from cover to cover because I was translating this book, and I learned a lot, and I'm sure that you will learn a lot as well. And with that,
I want to publicly thank Emil. He deserves the most credit here for taking the time to translate this book. I'm grateful. I've been grateful for more than 15-year friendship, I think, Emil. I met him as just a young graduate student in Indonesia. He was my host, and he's become my friend since then, my student, and for a little while. And we've just stayed in touch for all these years. I'm grateful for that and honored that you translated it. And I hope the book serves some good purpose in Indonesia. My hat's off to you, Emil.
Thank you. I'm sure the book will be very beneficial for Indonesian people. So with that, I will return the stage to the moderator.